So that the question of a republic is very much based upon the subject of law. Okay? Now, it's interesting that the most dramatic case of attempting to base a nation on law was the American Republic. That up until that time, there was, kings and all sorts of different forms of government. But in 1776, and certainly in 1783, but in 1776, in the Declaration of Independence, the basis of the American Republic was stated forcefully. We said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator, not by other men, but by their Creator, with certain inalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, that it's precisely the study of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which were given to all men and women, is the basis of law, is the basis of government. And that any other attempt in history to base it on the will of a majority, the will of a minority, or just plain stupidity, anarchy, right, failed dramatically, and failed in the, and of course the implications for relative potential population density were disaster. So you cannot have a republic without a citizenship that understands natural law. There is no other basis. It does not matter opinion, it does not matter power, it does not matter anything, but that the population understands and is capable of communicating in literate language, as Shelley would say, passionate conceptions with respect to man and nature. Because you cannot have a republic, by the way, without literate language. Because that's how you develop your laws, right? They're constantly developing. Now, in direct contrast to this idea of government, there was another way that people have attempted to rule throughout history. And that is the question of populism. Right? Now, what is populism? And I think people know populists, right? They do not appeal to law. They appeal to emotion. They appeal to prejudice. They appeal to opinion. And that the basis of all populist is rhetoric, right? And in fact, Plato hated the school of rhetoric. That his big polemic was against the school of rhetoric. Because this kind of eloquence based upon prejudice was one of the most dangerous tools that individuals had. Now, where does populism come from? I mean, in other words, we're going at this. I'll go through the history of it, but I want you to get the conceptual basis of it. Populism comes specifically from Aristotle. And so does rhetoric come from Aristotle. And I know you've been discussing, and I suspect you have been discussing this question of Plato versus Aristotle. You probably had a class on that or something like that, many classes, I suspect. Now, Aristotle is one of the most evil thinkers in history. Because what he proposed, as you have heard, and I'll just reference in this discussion, what Aristotle proposed was that while there may be God, in fact, he said there was God, that because we are finite and God is infinite, there is no intelligible way that man can understand with his use of his own ability to think, can understand the nature of God and the nature of the universe. That what we can do is study what we see, but we cannot study the lawful order of causation, of a causality in the universe. We cannot know that because our intellect is finite, and God's intellect who created it is infinite. And on the basis of that, we cannot know the laws of the universe. The only thing we can know is sense perception, and the only thing we can know is not what causes things, but correlations, right? Correlations of things that happen. Therefore, mankind is incapable of knowing what creates things, therefore is incapable of understanding the laws of the universe. The only ones who can understand the laws of the universe, according to Aristotle, are the elect, are those who were given supernatural powers to speak directly to the spirits of the universe. Because since there was no intelligible way of approaching the problem of knowledge, then but yet things do change. You see that. Things change and you don't understand why. You had to have a priesthood who were endowed with special powers to do that kind of thing. This, by the way, was the cult of Apollo at Delphi, right? This cult priesthood was the only ones who could intercede for man with God. Okay? And this elect, were the only ones capable of ruling. The other aspect of Aristotle, which was totally noxious, is the idea that God, since he's infinite, doesn't really cause anything in the physical universe. Because he's infinite, the physical universe is finite, and if God causes anything in the universe, he would be finite, and therefore God cannot cause anything in the universe. Therefore the physical universe is evil, which is the basis of all Gnostic belief. That this is what we call Gnosticism, this is what we call cultism, this is what we call Cathars, right? The Cathars, right? But they come from, at least in the modern time, and when I say modern, I'm talking about 2,500 years ago in written history. I mean, you can date this back to Shakti, Shiva, you can date it back many thousands of years, even before Aristotle codified it, right? But this is where all the cult beliefs, the basis of all cult beliefs, is the idea that God is not causal in the universe. And therefore, but yet, since things do change, you do have an elect, and you believe that the physical universe is evil. It must be, because there's no causality. It's not rational. It's merely correlative. You can correlate things. If 99 times I push a rock and it goes X distance, right, you expect 100th time that will happen. But you don't know why. Right? All right, now therefore the basis of populism is this cult belief in the unintelligibility of the universe and the need for an elect, a small elite, to tell the people what is going on, right? Otherwise, if there is no truth, which, by the way, in the modern time we call Satanism, right? If there is no truth, then what are we doing here? If you cannot know the truth, why are you here? It's absurd, which, by the way, is the basis of all Satanism and evil. Right? Which is the reductio ad absurdum, is what the Frankfurt School in the modern time taught. After World War I, people became very demoralized when they saw that millions of people marched to their death in seemingly no purpose to the thing. And they said in the cafes of Germany and other places, they sat around and they said, God's dead, out of pure cultural pessimism. They said, God is dead. That's where the God is dead movement came from. They said God would not have allowed this to happen if he was alive. Right? And that's where you get this Satanism and the descent into pure hell, right? Which is what the modern era, has promulgated. Even Aristotle would have disagreed with that. He would have said at least there's correlation. These guys said there's no correlation. Everything is absurd. But anyway, we are going at the core, at the essence of what it means to be human. Because to be human is a rejection of these cult beliefs. To be human, as Lyndon LaRouche has defined it, and we're talking about the difference between human and beast, which should be the basis for government, is that human beings do affect the laws of the universe, as you've learned through Christian economy. And we only know we don't know through correlation. We know that we've affected the laws of the universe to the extent, as Genesis tells us, that we have increased and multiplied and were fruitful. That we know our knowledge, not as particular knowledge, but the overall effect of our knowledge is such that the overall relative potential population density has increased because of what we did. Whereas we don't know directly the laws of the universe because we can't step outside of the universe and look at it the way God looks at it. But we know it through change. We know the universe because we've affected successful change in the universe. Therefore, our knowledge is coherent with the laws of the universe. Otherwise, you would not have successful change. You would have a decrease in the relative potential population density. So you do not know facts. You know an array of knowledge, a geometry, such that by affecting that geometry, you change your ability to be fruitful and multiply. But you do not know facts. The idea, and only this cult stuff, tells you know facts. What you know is causality. That's what you know. You know it as becoming. And you know the becoming as, if it is fruitful, you will have a certain effect on the universe. That is the basis for government. If you attempt to found government without natural law, without an explicit understanding of natural law, which Plato and others were implicit, but now with Lynn, we have the most explicit statement in history of natural law. Therefore, we can have the best, most clear government in the history of mankind. And it is not by accident that an American would be the person who would find this. Because in the modern time, this idea of humanity in terms of a republic, explicitly a republic based on law, although I must say America is not what it was. But it is interesting, and it is very interesting. Lynn writes his own history about this. But I remember being so startled, it never occurred to me that, my God, the Constitution is based upon natural law. I mean, it never occurred to me. I just thought it was a body of laws, right? But that it was directly informed by implicit, as Hamilton makes it was the best in terms of articulating it, what we call economics, or American system economics, is based upon an idea of natural law. It was also interesting that an economist would discover this again, right? It was understood by Leibniz, but again, Leibniz was totally suppressed, and therefore was rediscovered. So therefore what we have is, and the reason I'm going through this is because you will never understand what the issues are in populism unless you understand it from this standpoint. Now, how do we get to the point? Well, I mean, how did populism occur in the modern time? Because it goes way back. But there's a very specific institutions that brought these populist ideas into the English-speaking world. And that's what I'm going to be discussing now. In other words, how was it that we came to the impasse that we have such lousy politicians and a population which understands nothing about this? What were the institutions that created this kind of denigration? Now, I want to start first at the height of European culture, which was the Italian Renaissance, in which the idea of natural law, based upon the ennoblement of what we call the imago viva Dei, there was a celebration in the Renaissance of the difference between man and the animal, based upon a very clear conception of, geometric conception of how man thinks and the implications of that thinking. Now, the oligarchies of Europe went crazy during the Renaissance. They said very straightforward, this cannot continue. Because if you base government on law, then these gods of Olympus, these ones who think they're above law, which is the basis of this oligarchy, they think they're above law. That since they can manipulate men, they think they can ultimately manipulate God and deny the laws of the universe, which they find they can in wars, famines, and disease, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse, right, comes to visit them as they continue to deny natural law. But the oligarchies of Western Europe decided that we must destroy the Renaissance. We must destroy this idea, this Platonic, Christian Platonic idea of the Renaissance. So they deployed through Venice. Now, Venice is an interesting place, one of the most evil places on this planet. Let me just give you a little quick prehistory of Venice. What you had was this Aristotelian. Remember, I'm talking about Aristotle, right? He's a Greek, right? And he was at the cult of Apollo at Delphi, which is where, in the modern time, this kind of cult Gnostic belief comes from. Well, this cult of Apollo at Delphi, when these guys win, they tend to destroy the nations, the host nations that they're in, through usury, mainly, right, and slavery. So they destroyed the very basis of their own existence. So they destroyed Greece. In fact, they made deals with the Persian Empire. Aristotle, by the way, had made a deal to bring in the Persian Empire to destroy Greece. He was actually a Persian agent, right? So after the Persian Empire destroys Greece, this cult of Apollo, cult of Delphi at Apollo, no, this cult of Apollo at Delphi, I'm sorry, they were also the banking center for all of Greece. And the way it worked is, if you wanted an oracle to say something to you, you had to give them money, right? And they would shake the dice or roll the entrails or whatever, right? And they would give you, whatever you wanted, depending on how much money. And then the woman would go crazy and shout and scream, and then the spin doctors on the side, the people watching this thing, would interpret her screams and shouts and entrails and other things, right? So much like today, by the way, in terms of the media, right? What he really meant to say was. But anyway, so this cult of Apollo at Delphi took over Rome, ancient Rome. They transplanted their money, and they transplanted their power to Rome. And they took over particularly the Roman military. Now, on the basis of their taking over Rome, of course, as St. Augustine indicates, they introduced all the cults and all the hedonistic beliefs into Rome. And on the basis of that, as usual, they destroyed Rome. So they picked up their money and they went to a place called Venice from Constantinople. They first went to Constantinople, which was back in Greece, and then they went to Venice. So that there is an unbroken, and we've documented this in great detail, there's an unbroken line of Aristotelian development from Delphi to Rome, from Rome to Constantinople under Christian guise, right, and then from Constantinople to Venice. Okay? Taking their money. Right? And always these 100 families or so, the monies are held in what we call fondees, or funds. And the funds tend to long survive the families, right? And what you have attached to the fondee are the politicians and the lawyers and others who defend the fondee to the extent of destroying a country. Whereas they'll defend the fondee before they'll allow a country to develop, right? It's all based on usury. Wherever you find Aristotelianism, you will always find usury. Always. And whenever you find cults, you'll find usury. Always, as a form of government. So now, okay, so now in Venice, they did a very tricky thing. Now let me explain to you a little something about Venice and the evil we're up against. Because Venice is one of the most evil places in the world, and has been. Now, from Venice, by the way, let me just give you sort of a history, sort of a geography of this thing. As usual, they destroyed Venice, right? So from Venice, they transplanted their money into Amsterdam and Britain, using mainly, although not only, in Venice they set up a ghetto. Ghetto is a word for, an enclave, the ghetto. It's an Italian word. And they put since all the Jews in Europe were not allowed in Europe, right, because of certain crazy laws, the majority of Jews in Europe ended up in Venice, in the ghetto. And the Venetian oligarchs used the people of the ghetto, since they were allowed to have usury, and by Christian law no one else could, they used them to transplant into Amsterdam, and they used them to transplant into Britain, right? They took the Italian money, or the old money, the old wealth, the fondee, using predominantly Jewish, although not only Jewish bankers, to take this, right, and spread it around Europe, to take over Europe. This was the split between the Nuovi, which means the new houses, which were the ones who went into Amsterdam and Britain, and the Vecchi, who stayed in Venice. Right? There was a split on how to move their money and how to survive, right? Now, why do I go through this? Because what happened is, the Venetians are the trickiest adversary in history, because they can play both sides of the fence at once, and always have. The critical element of Venetian rule is they can be what's called Delphic. Isn't that interesting? Delphic. Now, what does that mean? And I'll give you some very interesting things you should read to understand the mind of the Venetians. The most famous thing you can read, or the most interesting thing you can read, is by Friedrich Schiller. It's called The Ghost Seers. If you really want to understand the nature of the enemy, read The Ghost Seers. Well, it's in our books. G-H-O-S-T S-E-E-R-S. Ghost Seers, right? And it's an extremely intricate discussion of the Venetian mind. But what you find out through the Ghost Seers and through other writings, like Shakespeare wrote Othello about Venice. He also wrote Merchant of Venice about Venice. Probably the most devastating critique of Venice was written by a man by the name of Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe. It's in English, called The Jew of Malta, which is also about Venice, or Venetian methods, right? But what are Venetian methods? Since there is no truth, they're total chameleons. And I won't go through all the details of the Ghost Seer, but the core of you won't get it unless I give you a little hint, okay? The hint is, the way that Venice worked was that they had the Doge, who was at the top of the pyramid, and they'd have a Council of 10. Right? This Council of 10 had absolute power in Venice. And they could issue a death warrant for any reason. And every court in Venice would not prosecute if the Council of 10 issued such a death warrant. Because, you see, when you have a bunch of powerful families, if you let them just fight it out, which is what's happening in Italy all the time, there was always wars. Because everyone's so greedy, since they're not based upon any idea of natural law, everyone's so greedy, they were fighting all the time. So the only way you could keep peace among all these families, and you're only allowed, by the way, there were only 1,000 families that were allowed to have anything to do with government in Venice. Only 1,000 families. And then a little later they got another 200 more for other reasons. It's sort of a complicated story. But the only way you could keep them divided was have absolute power in the Council of Ten. I will go through the fact that Venice created the Reformation and created the Counter-Reformation. Which was the biggest devastation of religion in the history of Western Europe. We have it in detail, proof that the Venetians created the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, which is why religions are at each other's throat all the time. Because what got obscured through the whole process was the true nature of religion and the true nature of God, which was critical, because you cannot know natural law unless you know the nature of how God creates. But both sides of the Counter-Reformation and the Reformation were run by Aristotelians. Both sides. And there was a 30 years war that ensued, a religious war that ensued, based upon the Venetian manipulation of both the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And if you want to know why there's such confusion in organized religion, blame it on Venice. Because that's what happened. And we have seen religious wars, and Islam, by the way, we have proof Islam was created by Aristotelians. Absolutely. The Prophet Muhammad was a trained Aristotelian. Yeah. Yes, I will, but I want to get through the general thesis, but, you know, I'll go through, let me get through the general thesis and then get back to the question period, right? But he was a Nestorian Christian. He was not, you know. So therefore, we're in a bit of a pickle here. Western civilization is in a bit of a pickle. Because unless, and it's not a question of, sure, there are great Protestants, there are great Catholics, there are great Islam people. There are, there's no question about it, men of good faith and goodwill. But unless they begin to understand what unites them on the basis of the intelligibility of the laws of the universe, the Mosaic tradition, a tradition of Catholicism based upon the teachings of Augustine and clearly Christ, and certain Islamic traditions that come out of this, Platonic Islamic traditions, as there were Islamic traditions were based on Plato, directly against Aristotle, right, in the great caliphates of Baghdad. In other words, it wasn't just all bad, otherwise it wouldn't even be here. We certainly wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't have, you know, 5 billion people on this planet. I'm not trying to say everything's all bad, I'm trying to get at what's bad, and a way of intelligibly going at what is wrong, so that we don't make the same mistake again, right? Because we don't have much chance. We won't have another chance on this one, because it's getting pretty late in the game. So, what you have right now is, and let me go through it in a little bit of detail just to give you the general thesis. We've written about this, and I want everybody to read this, because it would take hours if I went through this. But at the monastery of San Giustina in Venice, the Counter-Reformation and the Reformation were plotted at the monastery, the Benedictine monastery of San Giustina, right in Venice. They were at the University of Padua. where this group of people, of Venetian oligarchical families, they were at the University of Padua, where this group of people, of Venetian oligarchical families, particularly Gasparo Contarini and Pietro Bembo and others, which we write about, they got together and decided on an approach toward reformation. They were Catholic prelates, all of them. And they decided on certain basic doctrine, which was the project democracy of its day, where they said the problem was that you cannot insist on the knowability of truth. That any doctrine that says that man, and particularly individuals of goodwill and good faith, could know truth was a blasphemous doctrine. That all we could have was faith. That's all humans were allowed, faith. Right? Now, but this was in a Catholic, a nominally Catholic monastery outside in Venice. Now they worked with others who were attempting to break into 1,000 pieces to unleash democracy in religion upon the world. In other words, yes, clearly the Catholic Church needed massive reformation at that point, right? There's no question about it. Many Catholics of good faith had decided that was necessary, right? But what had happened was that if you're going to reform something, you have to take it from a higher standpoint, rather than have a million opinions proliferate. Unless you had a higher science, as Nicholas of Cusa, as you will hear tonight, had, and attempted to reform the Catholic Church from a higher standpoint on the basis of Concordantia Catholica. The attempt to reform it on a lower standpoint, on an Aristotelian standpoint, which took man away from intelligible knowledge of the universe, based upon hatred of the physical universe, would allow you no science, would allow you no relative potential population density, right? And by unleashing what was essentially a project democracy in which you get 100, not just in the Protestant Reformation, but remember the Anglican Reformation occurred at that point too, which was Venetian control. Henry VIII was totally controlled by Venice when he decided, well, I've got to have, I'm going to form a church on the fact that I want to divorce this lady, right? I mean, that's not the basis to form a church. There might be other reasons to form a church, but that's not a good one, right? So that what you had was a proliferation of Aristotelian cults throughout Western civilization at that point. And it's interesting, and you shouldn't be shocked to know, that a man by the name of Paolo Sarpi, who was a Venetian Servite monk, was working with all the German princes to foster war, the 30 Years' War, to break up the Catholic Church, right? Now, there are bases on which you might change things, but to start a war, working with putative Catholics from Venice against the church would allow you to be a bit suspicious about what happened. Should make you a bit suspicious about what was up. Right? But this is Venice. They unleashed the 30 Years' War based upon religious disagreements. Calvin, directly Venice to Amsterdam. Directly Venice to Amsterdam. Right? And many of the bishops in the Catholic Church were totally Venetian. So we've had a mess. We've had a mess. The whole damn thing was manipulated so that they could have power and manipulate, because the way the Venetians worked is they were Catholics, they were Protestants, they were Islamicists, they were everything. You cannot defeat the Venetians unless you start from a higher epistemological standpoint. If you do not start, you cannot tell. It's not the label that people give themselves. And that's the essence of the ghost seer. The essence of this Schiller thing is based upon the fact you cannot know anything by its labels. You have to know something by its content. Otherwise, you can be easily fooled. Very easily fooled. But they can be defeated. And that's the point of our discussions. Because if you start with a clear conception of natural law, they go crazy about Lyndon LaRouche. They see in him the most fearful danger they have ever seen in their history. They go crazy about a person like that because he sees right through all the labels. And he doesn't look at the labels. He looks at the content. Right? And once you look at the content and judge the content, you know who's good and you know who's bad. And it doesn't really matter what their labels are, because it is an intelligible, knowable way of doing that. Leibniz was the same way. Leibniz was exactly the same way, and they hated Leibniz's guts. They were terrified of Leibniz, right? And they faced Kepler the same way. Bach, Mozart, the same way. Didn't matter what their religion was. What's the content? What's the content? What are we going at here? What do we have to understand? Right? What are we listening for? And that's the critical fight. The critical fight in Western civilization is, in fact, the knowledge of natural law. And the fight of Plato versus Aristotle. And the knowability of law versus the mysticism and Gnosticism of Aristotelian method. That's been the split in Western civilization. This came to a head in England, which is why most English colonies, including the United States, are totally insane on the issue of religion. Because of this. Now, how did this happen? Now, I happen to be somewhat of an expert on this. Not because I intended to, but I started out being a great fan of John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost. I mean, I was a great fan. I used to teach classes and all sorts of things on this guy, right? But there was always something a little bit, I always wondered, it seemed very violent, the polemic in it, you know, and I'm not a violent person by nature, so I always wondered, maybe there's something wrong here. So through this, I began to study something called British Israel, the idea of British Israel, and where it came from. Because Milton was the great purveyor of British Israel. Okay? I mean, it came before, clearly, but it was but it took its height in the reign of Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, who came to power in the 1630s, 1640s in England. From the 1640s to the 1660s is when Oliver Cromwell came to power in England. And there was a proliferation of the wildest cults you could imagine. And they took over England. These religious cults took over England. It's a long story, and if you're interested, I'll go into it in the question and answer period, but that's what happened. You had Socinians, millenarians, Quakers, I mean, you name it, everything came in. Anglicans, Catholics, I mean, the whole place was ripped to ribbons, right? And there's a long story behind that, but that's what happened, right? There's a long story of religious war. England was ripped from religious war from the time of Henry VIII. I mean, you know, Henry VIII founds the Anglican Church. Then there's a war with the Anglicans and Presbyterians. Then there's a war, they killed Mary, Queen of Scots, behead her, right? Then you have, from Mary, Queen of Scots, you have a number of this Cromwell people come in. And then there was about 20 to 30 religions at the time of the Cromwell's takeover of England, right? And it was based on populist dogma. A lot of it was populist dogma, and very powerful priests. Some were very good, some were very bad. You have to know the difference, right? But the point was that what happened? What had happened was that the Venetian method had really even gotten out of hand, which it tends to do. It creates Frankenstein monsters. Because what you're introducing is pluralism into religion. In other words, since there is no organized doctrine of religion, then some will have insights, some won't have insights, you know, and you're introducing hundreds of cults and hundreds of differences of opinion, which you can manipulate, because that's Venetian method. You manipulate one cult against another cult. You can play one against another. That's old British divide and conquer, right? That's the way they do things. Divide on ethnic lines, divide on religious lines, find whatever divisions you can and begin to foster them, right? Now, the basis, though, the core of these beliefs, which you will find in Milton, and you will find emphatically in British Israel, and you won't be surprised when I tell you, what do you think the core of the belief is? The doctrine of the elect, right? The idea that only certain priests, right, can know certain things. It's the doctrine of the elect, which is the basis for racial divisions and other things, right? And by the way, you find this in Judaism, very emphatically. In Orthodox Judaism, only certain people can know things and other people cannot know things. These are the helots, right? The people who don't know anything are called helots, or, you know, beasts, right? So you'll find the doctrine of the elect, and you will also find emphatically in Milton and emphatically in the more radical Calvinist and certainly the British Israel, the idea that the physical universe is purely evil. Right? And read that in Paradise Lost, you will find what I'm saying there, right? Which is a long epic poem. Now, Paradise Lost was written as a refutation of Dante's Commedia, right? The famous called Divine Comedy by Dante, written in the 13th century, which is the basis for the Italian Renaissance. In which, yes, it is true, as Augustine knew, and certainly Luther and others referenced Augustine in this regard, that man is weak. There is no question about it. And therefore he needs faith. But his faith informs his goodwill and his works. And that the universe itself is not purely evil. That is Gnosticism. That is the basis for Gnosticism. And anyone who preaches such a thing is a Gnostic. Right? Because we've seen it through history. But the point is that to the extent that these cult doctrines became the basis of British Israel, racialism, and therefore racial divisions, and other things proliferated in the English empires. Right? The doctrine of the elect, by the way, was always the basis upon which you would say blacks or Chinese or this one or that one were not God's children. That's how they argued it. That's how they argued it in the United States, the basis for slavery. When they argued it coherently, they argued it on the basis of it says so in the Bible, right? That they were elect and therefore others are not equal, right? Which, that's the way they argued it. And this was the basis of British Israel. And John Milton. Now, what's interesting is that this stuff got fostered by the Venetians, because it turns out that John Milton, in his early childhood, in his early years of being a poet, was toured by a man by the name of Henry Wotton. Henry Wotton was the ambassador of Britain to Venice. And they toured Milton in 1620 from England to Geneva to meet with the Venetian oligarchs in Geneva who had taken over Geneva, right? The Diodati, who were the guys who, after Calvin died, took over Geneva, the Diodati. And then from there, he was toured directly to Venice and met with Paolo Sarpi, the putative Catholic Venetian Franciscan, Servite guy, to have discussions with all of the Venetians. So the putative great British Israelite Milton goes to meet with the Venetians in Geneva and goes down, and is toured by the Henry Wooten, and goes down to meet with the so-called Catholics in Venice to organize a continental conspiracy. Right? And that continental conspiracy was the basis of the 30 Years' War. That's what happened. So how did this come to the English-speaking colonies? Well, they had this restoration in which I don't know, I guess this is the Hanover House came in, right? The House of Hanover, the glorious revolution. And they kicked out all these other religions, right? Or they were told these other religions to go to the English colonies to practice their religion, right? Now, I'm not saying it's all a conspiracy. What I'm saying is, to the extent that the basis of these other cults were proliferating in the English colonies, then what happens is that populism was almost a very natural offshoot of these kinds of cults, because it was not based upon the intelligibility of truth. Because if you're going to say, well, gee, I feel good after this, well, that might be good or bad. You don't know, right? But since you have not been educated to the basis of natural law to understand what is intelligible in terms of the physical universe and the physical universe that God created, then you are left to opinion. That's all you are left. And on the basis of these kinds of things, what happens is that you have a highly uneducated population in terms of fundamentals. And the populist demagogues are always appealing to the idea that the only thing you know is that which you can perceive. Always. They never go against your prejudice. And in fact, since the media and the way that this whole thing is manipulated is based upon prejudice and the creation of prejudice, unless you are willing to challenge people's prejudice, you are a populist. You're feeding into the thing, whether you like it or not. If you attempt to develop your polemics on the basis of what is acceptable to people, then you're not doing anything. Because they've been trained in the exact opposite way. That there is only opinion. And therefore the basis of our organizing is the exact opposite of populism. And the way that you defeat populism is by the fact that populism doesn't work. The law, it contradicts the laws of the physical universe. And because it contradicts the laws of the physical universe, what happens is at points of crisis, people realize it didn't work, and they look for alternative actual solutions. Now, if at a point of crisis you play a game with them, and you give them something acceptable, as opposed to, look, I'm going to challenge you in a way that you haven't been challenged before, because I love you and I want to save you. Right? If you don't have that idea about organizing, don't get into it. Because at the point of crisis, they're going to look for different solutions and different answers, because they've seen all the other answers. They've seen the populist rhetoric, and they felt good on Sundays, right? And they, Reverend Bevel calls it religious entertainment, I mean, these guys are great. I mean, some of them are very funny, some of them are quite witty, and they have partial insights, But ultimately, at the point of crisis, everybody says, my God, I've been wasting a lot of my time, right? And let me get serious here, right? And you're going to, so therefore the key, which is why you're going through these classes, and they're hard, because they contradict all your prejudices. You have a prejudice about most things, right? You have an idea that there's hard facts. I can prove to you there's no such a thing as a fact. I'll take any fact you give me and I'll tear it to ribbons, and I'll prove to you it doesn't exist. Okay? I'll prove to you it doesn't exist, not in that way. It might have happened, but it doesn't exist in that way. That's not what caused it. Facts don't cause facts. Therefore, if you don't know what caused it, you don't know what it is. You don't even know it exists. You don't even know a fact exists if you don't know what caused it. You say, I see it. Well, what happens if I blind you? You don't see it anymore, do you? And I can do that ad infinitum. Right? So the question is, what is causal? What caused? And how is that causality coherent? And what are the laws of the universe? And on the basis of that, you can found a republic. And you can found a republic on the basis of the nobility of the individual soul, on its noble qualities. Because what you do is, if you reduce men and women to opinion, to mere opinion, then you reduce them to hedonism. Because the only thing that they're left with is their feelings. And you've reduced them to hedonism, to a very small, narrow person. And because you've only given them their feelings, because you haven't given them, they have no sense of their own dignity, they have no sense of their own worth, and they say, well, how am I any different than an animal, ultimately? And that's the problem with these cults, and that's the purpose of these cults. Right? Because you see, if you know the truth, and you're surrounded by contrary opinion, but yet you know the truth, and you fight for the truth, then your soul and what you've done for humanity will continue long after you're gone. Right? Because you're not based, your sense of identity on other people. Right? You're based upon, your sense of identity is based upon what is true with respect to God's law. And if you know that about your life has been worth living. Because you've taught others by example or other ways. And therefore you've solved the fundamental question, what are we doing here? You're not determined by other people's opinion. You're here as human beings for a very specific purpose, to become ever less imperfect. You will never become perfect, you will never become God, but you'll become ever less imperfect. That is why you're here. That is why God created humans and not animals. I mean, he created animals, but he created humans for a very specific purpose. And that our forms of government must rest upon that fundamental difference between man and the animal, and not reduce men to animals and opinion and mere sense certainty. That is the basis of government. That is the basis of law. And the populist, Venetian in particular, in the way it's come through Western civilization, have reduced man to a lower level. We, on the other hand, are directly going against that to change the course of history. We can do that. But you've got to master this. Frankly, there is no other way. There's no tricks. There's no gimmicks. There's no way I can give you a quick, if you say this, then that'll happen. That's not the way it's going to work. Now, it's interesting because I want to discuss, finally, the question of, which is posed by Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And I have it here, and it just happens to be in the last EIR. But I want you to think about it from what we've just discussed. Let me just read it to you again, because the words should resound. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived, so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause which they gave their last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, and that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth in freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from this earth. And that is the basis of a republic. That the only alternative would be to turn ourselves back to the oligarchs. And we've seen what a mess they've made of the world. Because all they care about is their own power and the increase of their own power through usury and any other basis they can. The alternative government is based upon the Christian idea of the nobility of the soul and the individual, and increasing the power to become ever less imperfect through education, through science, and through art. That we come closer to knowledge of the true nature of the universe that God created. And that is what a republic is about. So that's what I have.